When everything goes wrong, when the enemies triumph, when all the weaknesses surface, when cancer strikes, when the bribed judge gets away with it, when the killer walks free, is God still at work? Is his kingdom still growing? Or could it be that even when you feel your life is being smashed apart, God is spreading his good news in a powerful new way? That's the good news about persecution, but it never feels like good news at the time. Years ago, when I was traveling in China, I met someone who had known the great Chinese leader Watchman Nee. Nee was one of the great figures of Chinese church history, the first man really to establish the house churches of China. He told me about one famous incident. The government was starting to crack down, and Nee needed to gather all the leaders together to tell them how to negotiate these tough times. So he arranged for them all to come, I think it was to Shanghai, and he would speak to them. The police got wind of this meeting, and they arranged to attend in plain clothes. And the moment Nee spoke would be the signal to rush the platform and arrest him. Now, Watchman Nee was told of this, and he was advised not to come, but he desperately wanted to give some guidance to his followers. Times were hard. Times were going to get harder. They needed to hear some advice from the great man. So this is what he did. Nee came onto the platform. He just strode to the lectern, and then all he did was just look at everybody. Didn't say a word. For 5 whole minutes, he just looked at the audience. And they began to wonder, has he lost his nerve? Does he know what's going to happen to him if he speaks? And then he put on a very angry face, and he picked up the glass that was full of water for the speaker, and he dashed it onto the platform. And he crunched the glass, looking smug with his work. And everybody wondered, what's he doing? What's going on? Then he stopped, and he looked down at the pieces. His face began to change from hatred to horror. He held his hands to his temple. How could I have been so stupid? His expression seemed to say. And he got down on his hands and knees and began to pick up the pieces of the smashed glass. And he tried to put the glass back together again. Of course, this was futile, but he tried for 5 minutes, and then he gave up and walked off. He hadn't said a word, so the police couldn't act. But everybody, all the church leaders in that meeting, knew exactly what he had said. And I remember this man that I met. He said Nee was acting out a parable. He represented the state, and the glass was the church. And the time would come when the state would smash the church. And that would be hard to live through, but it was coming. But then, the state would realize that it had made a mistake, because in smashing the church, it had not destroyed it. It had just dispersed it underground, where it was beyond state control. And so the state would realize its mistake and try to reconstitute the glass, try to bring the church back up to the surface where it could see what was going on. And he said it would fail because the smashing had been too thorough. Never again would the state be able to control the church. And that is exactly what happened. That's how it played out historically. Mao Zedong came along and he smashed the churches in China. But the Christians went into the homes, and there the gospel became part of Chinese culture, embedding itself in families, sitting rooms, apartment blocks, in a way that missionaries had only dreamt of for centuries. One Shanghai pastor put it this way: before the early 1960s, we practiced Christianity in churches and hardly anywhere else. After the persecutions, we practiced it in our homes and therefore everywhere else. It took a smashing. And that's one of the stories that explains how China experienced such a massive revival. And that is a contemporary rerun of what happens in the book of Acts. From chapter 1 to chapter 6, everything goes great for the early church in Acts. The action all occurs in Jerusalem, there's growth, there's healing, and the church keeps on expanding. But the Holy Spirit knows something that the apostles did not. That if the people of God stayed in Jerusalem, then the gospel of God would die in Jerusalem. Because at this point, the apostles have no idea that Gentiles should also believe in Jesus. They thought the gospel was just for Jews. So in chapter 7, there comes a smashing. Stephen is put on trial, and following his martyrdom, we read that a great wave of persecution rose up. And then we see the line added, all the believers except the apostles were scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. And so we see that persecution always does two things as it scatters believers. One, power gets shifted downwards to people who've never had it before. So who becomes the first man to take the gospel to a non-Jew? Well, it's not an apostle, because they were staying in Jerusalem. It was a deacon whose name was Philip. Now, that wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been this smashing. In Jerusalem, the apostles were the teachers and evangelists. The deacons, they were in charge of the fabric and the food. Persecution changes all that. Power shifts downwards to people who've never had it before. Philip finds himself able to preach, and he is the first cross-cultural missionary of the church. He wasn't ordained. He shouldn't have done it. The Holy Spirit doesn't care. And the second great gift of persecution is not only that power gets shifted downwards to people who've never had it before, but people get pushed outward to places they've never been before. Who does Philip share this gospel with? He shares it with the Samaritans. And they were half Jews, but very despised in Jerusalem. The hatred between Jew and Samaritan ran very deep, like enmity between Catholic and Protestant, maybe in Northern Ireland. It would never have crossed Philip's mind to share Jesus with the Samaritans if he'd stayed in Jerusalem. But because he found himself on the run in Samaria, he preached. And suddenly, he realizes Jesus died for Samaritans too. So it was in China. The gospel goes down to the people who've never had it before, ordinary people, and to places where it's never been before, the family unit. And from that came the world's largest revival. But it took a smashing. Behind all this lies a very disturbing question, though. Why does the church appear to need a smashing, or persecution, or hard times in order to share the gospel? And this is one of the most sobering truths of the Bible. God's people have a fatal tendency to try to keep God to themselves. If you want to say God is for everyone, you encounter very often the most resistance from the people of God themselves. A smashing. It often takes a smashing. But that's how the good news jumps a barrier. That's how the good news gets from Jerusalem to Rome. That's how the good news gets from a Jewish enclave to the center of the Gentile world. It took a smashing. It's hard news, but it's good news. Listen for the crunch. It's good news. It's a good sound. It's the gospel getting out.